Mr. O'Neill, you have kindly agreed to read one of your new stories called
Don't Wake the King by Richard.
Thank you. The King of the North was one of those people who didn't get much sleep at night, and as a result was terribly grumpy the next day. You may have met someone like that before. You may even have someone in your family who does it. So you know they can be a bit annoying, but when someone is a king, they can be really annoying. This particular king would always stay up late and so get past the best time to sleep, and then would often drift off to sleep only to wake up within an hour or less. And when he did wake up, he would blame the first person he saw for waking him. If you had just walked past the king, then he would say, "It was you walking too loud that woke me up." Once one of the servants was sewing in the next room when the king woke up, and seeing this man sewing shouted, "You woke me up with your sewing, you loud fool!" The king, not being able to sleep at night, unlike everyone else in the castle, apart from the night watchman of course, tried to sleep during the day. But he couldn't, because he had quite a few king-like things to do. For example, people would come into his bedchamber and tell him he had an important visitor to meet, or that he had an important paper to sign, and the king, being the king, would have to do them. He was often so tired that he didn't really know what he was signing half the time, or what he was agreeing to, so therefore made some pretty big mistakes, like buying 160 very expensive suits of armour when he only had 10 knights, or agreeing to visit the caves where the fire-breathing dragon was supposed to live to tell it off about frightening people. As the king found out, lack of sleep makes you do some daft and even dangerous things. Every time the king did get off to sleep, whatever time of the day at night it was, a message would go out to everyone in the walled city. "Shh, the king is sleeping, and shh, don't wake the king." People in the walled city took it very seriously because they knew how angry the king was when he was woken up. To avoid this, they whispered to each other instead of talking. They wore soft-soled slippers on their feet rather than ordinary shoes, and they even put soft leather covers over the horses' metal shoes. Everything that you can imagine, and some you can't, was done to keep the city as quiet as possible, so as not to wake the king.
During one of the king's daytime sleepings, a stranger turned up at the walled city. Walking through the gates and noticing how quiet it was, he shouted, "Anyone home?" Immediately, at least 20 people in their loudest whisper said, "Shh, don't wake the king." The man, a travelling storyteller, having spotted the turrets of the castle from a long way away, had hoped that the people who lived in the city would be interested in his stories. He also hoped that they might even give him some food and a bit of money in exchange for listening to his stories, so he could then carry on with his journey. The travelling storyteller, having never been shushed before by so many people, was surprised and intrigued to find out more. He said,
"Is your king like Sleeping Beauty? Is there a prize of great riches for waking him? Have you tried kissing him?"
"We don't want to wake him up, you fool, and we certainly don't want to kiss him. We want him to sleep,"
whispered one of the king's most trusted servants.
"Oh, have you tried patting his back and carrying him around?"
whispered the travelling storyteller.
"He's not a baby, you foolish stranger."
The king's servant whispered back.
"Why isn't he able to go to sleep in the first place?"
whispered the travelling storyteller. The servant told him that the king often stayed up late with his friends, dancing and drinking wine, or counting his money in the early hours and then worrying about his money being stolen, amongst other things. They all heard a huge shout and turned to see the king, angry and awake, standing on top of the castle, and he was pointing a finger at the travelling storyteller.
"Oi, you stranger!"
The king shouted.
"You have woken me up, you idiot!"
"I'm sorry, Your Majesty."
"Shh!" The travelling storyteller shouted back and was immediately shushed by everyone else.
"Bring him to me."
The king ordered his guards, pointing at the storyteller.
Soon the travelling storyteller was stood in front of the king, explaining who he was and what he did. "I am but a poor storyteller, Your Majesty, and I travel around this kingdom and others, telling stories to entertain people, to bring them news and to teach them new things. People then give me a little food, clothing, or even money for my efforts, which allows me to continue my journey." Said the king. "What kind of stories do you tell exactly?" The travelling storyteller smiled and said enthusiastically, "All kinds, Your Majesty, from adventure stories of my travels in far-off lands, of mountains and valleys, of snow and ice, of heat and dust, to stories of animals large and small, fierce and timid, stories of joy and fun and light, stories to cheer people up and stories to help people sleep." "Sleep, you say?" exclaimed the king, now very interested. "If you can tell me a story that can help me sleep, it will certainly keep you out of my dungeon. And if your stories are very good, then I may even give you a little money. You can tell me your best story now," demanded the king. "Certainly," said the storyteller. "But please, may I have some food and water, your majesty? You see, I have travelled a long way to your city, and I haven't eaten since this morning." "Very well," said the king, and sent his servants to bring some food for the storyteller, who sat and ate it quite slowly, because it was the best food he'd tasted for a long time, and he wanted to savour every bit of it. The storyteller, realising that it was getting very late in the day, asked the king if there was something in the castle where he could sleep for the night and get rested and ready to continue his journey the next day. The king, keen to hear a story, ordered that a bed be made up for the storyteller in the servants' quarters. The storyteller thanked the king, who sat impatiently in his huge comfy king chair waiting for his story. The storyteller started to tell the king a story of his journey to the city. The story the storyteller told was so vivid and lifelike that the king felt as if he was there, taking every step. A really tiring journey, and the storyteller's voice was so smooth and beautiful that the king couldn't help but fall asleep. The next morning the storyteller was up, washed and dressed good and early, and ready to continue his journey. Before he could leave the castle, he was told by a guard that the king had sent for the storyteller, and he, the guard, was to take him. The storyteller stood before the king and immediately noticed that his majesty looked a little healthier than the last time he saw him. His eyes weren't as red or as puffy. His skin was less grey-coloured, and he seemed less angry.
The king looked at the storyteller and said,
Storyteller, I had 4 hours of unbroken sleep last night, and I'm sure it's something to do with your story. I want you to tell me another story again this evening. You will have your food the same, and then you will tell me a story. I will sleep again.
Your Majesty,
said the storyteller.
I would like to, but I have to earn my living, as I cannot tell stories in your city, because everyone has to stay so quiet. You see, my stories are often loud and full of laughter. I must go move on to another place.
No,
Said the king.
I need you here. You must stay. I will give you money, food, a room in the castle, anything you want, but please tell me another story.
The servants were amazed when they heard the king say please, as they'd never heard him say please to anyone before, ever. The storyteller realised the king needed him, and he agreed to stay and tell him another story. That evening after his food, but before he told the king his story, he asked the king what he would usually do at that time instead of having a story. The king said, I often count my money. I have so much of it, you see, there isn't enough time to count it during the day, and then I have to make sure it's locked away safely in case anyone tries to steal it. I often have to check that it is locked away properly, and then I check again and again. What do you do with all your money, your majesty? The storyteller asked. Do with it? Do with it? Exclaimed the king. I don't do anything with it. I keep it locked up safely away, and then I get it out and I count it and I count it again, and then I lock it safely away again. Oh, replied the storyteller, and then he told the king another story, this one about a man who had lots of possessions, but he still wanted more. This man found that he had lots of money and possessions, but very few friends. But in the end, he found a way of making friends and became much happier. The next morning, the storyteller once again was up, washed and dressed good and early, and ready to continue his journey. But once again, before he could leave the castle, he was told by a guard that the king had sent for the storyteller, and he, the guard, was to take him. The storyteller once again stood before the king and immediately noticed that he looked even healthier than the day before. His eyes weren't as red or puffy at all, and his skin was starting to return to a much more natural and healthier colour. The king even seemed quite relaxed. The king looked at the storyteller and said, Storyteller, I had 5 hours unbroken sleep last night, and even had a nice dream, and I'm sure it's something to do with your story, so I want you to tell me another story again this evening. You will have your food the same, and then you will tell me a story, and I will sleep again. Once again, the storyteller said, Your Majesty, I would like to, but I have to earn my living, and as I cannot tell stories in your city because everyone has to stay so quiet, and my stories are often loud and full of laughter, so I must move on to another place. No, said the king, I need you here, you must stay, and if you do, I will give you a large amount of money, food, a room in the castle, anything you see in the city that you want, you can have it, but just please stay and tell me another story. The The servants were once again amazed when they heard this, as they'd never heard the king offer so much to anyone before ever. And what was this about, a dream? The storyteller realised the king really needed him, and he agreed to stay and tell him yet another story that evening after his food. But before he told the king a story, he asked the king about his dream. The king said, "Ah, the dream. I was walking around the walled city and my people were coming up to me and thanking me for being such a good king, and..." The king hesitated. "And?" said the storyteller. "I was with a woman who it seemed was my wife," said the king, blushing slightly as he said it. "But of course it was only a dream, and although I want a wife, how would I ever trust that a woman wouldn't want to be my wife just because of all my money?" The storyteller told the king another story. This time the story was about a very rich man who was looking for a wife, and he went to great lengths to check that the woman he met worked just after him for his money. The story was exhausting, and the king, as he was thinking what he would have to do to get a wife who loved him for himself and not just for his money, by the time the story was finished, the king was fast asleep.
Early the next morning, the storyteller was woken by the noise of loud footsteps. He then felt a large hand grab the front of his nightshirt. He quickly opened his sleepy eyes and realised that he was staring straight at the very sharp-pointed end of a sword which had been held by the king's guard.
Get up.
The guard shouted.
You have killed the king, and I've been instructed to take you to see the body before you are put in the dungeon.
But it's the middle of the night, and I've been nowhere near the king.
Protested the storyteller.
Silence!
Ordered the guard as he marched the storyteller into the king's room at sword point. When he got there, he saw a number of king's men standing around the king's bed. "Look what you have done, stranger," said one of the king's men. "You have killed our king. We wanted you to see what you have done before we put you in the dungeon. We should never have trusted a spend so much time with our king." He threw his hands up in the air and shouted, "Oh, what are we to do?"
As he did this, the king opened his eyes and said,
Who makes all this noise and dares to wake me up?
The king's men were shocked and relieved as they stood around the king, who said,
Why are you pointing that sword at my storyteller?
they told the king they thought he had died.
I was in deep sleep, you fools.
He said, and ordered them out of his room.
Soon everyone in the castle went back to sleep. A few hours later, the storyteller was up again, washed, dressed, good and early, and ready to finally continue his journey. But once again, before he could leave the castle, he was told by a guard that the king had once again sent for the storyteller, and the guard was to take him. The storyteller once again stood before the king and immediately noticed that he looked even healthier than the day before. His eyes were sparkling, his skin looked very fresh, smooth and healthy. The king looked at the storyteller and said, "Storyteller, even though I was rudely woken by your guards earlier this morning, as were you, I still had 8 hours sleep last night and had the most wonderful dreams, and I know it was to do with your story. Storyteller, I know you have to leave and continue with your travels, but before you do, I want to give you the money that I promised." The king signalled to one of his guards, and they handed over a large bag filled with gold coins to the storyteller. The storyteller thanked the king, and before he could say anything else, the king said, "I also said you could have anything you saw in the city. Have you decided what that thing is to be?" The storyteller nodded and said, "Your Majesty, I would like to have the square in the middle of the walled city for 1 hour to tell some of my stories to your people and be as loud as I need to be." "Yes, of course," said the king. "Your Majesty, there's one more thing," said the storyteller, holding up the bag of gold coins. "If I may be allowed to keep but just 2 of these coins and give the rest away to the poor." Before the king could give his answer, the chief guard, who had become quite jealous of the storyteller, and especially his huge bag of gold, spoke out angrily. "Your Majesty," he said, "this man is a fool and an ungrateful one at that. He insults you by saying he's going to give your gold, royal gold, to the poor. Shall I take him to the dungeons?" The king laughed and looked at the guards, who were quite taken aback by his laughter. "My dear fellow," said the king, "I have learned much from my stories and my dreams and my long and healthy sleeps. You see, if the storyteller travels with a full bag of gold, which is far more than he'll ever need, it will be heavy to carry. As he travels, he will start to worry about his gold being stolen. He may not be able to sleep at night, wondering if someone will take it away while he's sleeping. He also finds that he makes not one new friend on his travel. Because every new person he meets, he thinks they may be a robber. If they become his friend, he may wonder if people are becoming his friend just because he has so much gold. He may buy lots of things with the gold and then worry about them being stolen. He may even stop his travels so he can watch those things all the time, all because of the money he has saved. He may have no sleep, no friends, and no happiness. When the king finished, the storyteller turned to him and said, "Your Majesty, you have learned much from my stories." The king smiled, and they both set off to the city square to tell their stories and to give away most of their money. That night they both slept soundly, neither of them worrying or bothering about the following day, as they both knew, as long as they slept well, it would take care of itself. I'm pleased to say that the king and the storyteller and everyone in the walled city slept happily ever after.